January 1943. 20,000 feet above northern Germany, the sky is a frozen sea of silver vapor and flame. A formation of B-17s cuts through the thin air, engines roaring in perfect rhythm. The temperature inside the fuselage has dropped far below zero, frost clinging to every window and gun sight. The men are silent, faces pale under oxygen masks, eyes locked on the horizon. Then, a flash from above. Black specks dive from the sun, twisting, growing larger, Messerschmitts. Their cannons open fire, shells streaking through the formation. A tail gunner yells into his headset, but the radio crackles under the thunder of engines and gunfire. He squeezes the twin triggers of his Browning Mez 2 The heavy machine guns erupt, sending streams of bright orange tracers tearing upward. Each round cuts through the icy air at nearly 3,000 feet per second. The vibration shakes his bones. The air smells of burnt powder and oil. Above the clouds, men and metal clash in thin oxygen and silence, and the outcome of air power will hinge not only on courage, but on the relentless rhythm of .50 caliber fire. By the beginning of 1943, the air war over Europe had become a contest of endurance and innovation. The Allies sought to cripple the German war machine not by land invasion, but by striking at its heart, the factories, railways, and oil refineries that fed Hitler's armies. The United States Army Air Forces, still young compared to the veteran Luftwaffe, believed that precision daylight bombing could shatter Germany's industrial core. They would fly high, fly straight, and hit key targets with mechanical accuracy. It was a daring doctrine, and one that demanded a weapon capable of surviving direct confrontation. The Americans brought with them a machine unlike any seen before, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. Its very name reflected confidence. It was massive, stable, and built to withstand punishment. But its greatest strength lay in its teeth, the 12-13 Browning M2, 50 caliber machine guns mounted across its frame, from nose to tail, waist to turret. The Flying Fortress bristled with heavy firepower designed to repel fighters from every direction. The weapon itself had already earned a reputation before the war. Designed by John Moses Browning in the 1920s, the M2 heavy-barrel machine gun fired the 50 caliber BMG cartridge, a half-inch of solid metal power capable of piercing armor, tearing through fuselages, and maintaining accuracy at distances most weapons could not reach. Each gun could fire about 500 rounds per minute, its mechanism simple yet brutally reliable. While other nations favored lighter, faster-firing machine guns or 20mm cannons, the United States chose a middle path, a weapon powerful enough to destroy aircraft, yet light enough to be mounted in numbers. This balance became the backbone of American air defense. On paper, the plan looked promising. In practice, the challenges were immense. Flying at 20,000 feet meant dealing with extreme cold, low oxygen, and thin air that made engines strain and bullets drift. Gunners had to operate bare-handed at times to keep control, their gloves stiff from frost. Frozen oil could jam feed belts. Even breathing required oxygen masks that sometimes froze solid from condensation. Despite these hardships, American crews pressed forward. Their missions into occupied Europe were long, often stretching 6 to 8 hours, across miles of enemy territory, where every cloud could hide a German interceptor. The men of the 8th Air Force, stationed in England, began to understand that their survival depended not just on skill, but on the unwavering rhythm of the .50s that guarded their steel fortress. Below them, Germany watched closely. The Luftwaffe was not easily impressed. Having dominated the skies during the early years of the war, its pilots viewed the American strategy as reckless. Daylight raids exposed bombers to direct attacks. Without escorts capable of following them deep into Germany, the bombers would have to rely entirely on their defensive firepower. But that was precisely the test America intended to prove. The .50 caliber was more than ammunition. It was a statement of industrial faith. Each round carried the precision of American engineering and the promise that the bomber could defend itself even in the heart of enemy airspace. In the factories of Connecticut, Ohio, and New York, lines of workers, men and women, assembled millions of cartridges a month. Brass, lead, and copper flowed like rivers. The scale was staggering. By 1944, American industry would produce billions of .50 caliber rounds, ensuring that no bomber ever went to war unarmed. The weapon's effectiveness was not only in its power, but its standardization. Whether mounted on bombers, fighters, or ground vehicles, every M2 used interchangeable parts and ammunition. This meant logistics were simpler, maintenance faster, and production more efficient. The United States had achieved something Germany could not: a seamless marriage between industrial capacity and battlefield utility. As the air campaign gathered momentum, the Allied High Command believed the bomber offensive could shorten the war, destroy the factories, choke the fuel supply, and the German army would crumble. But every plan had a cost, and the first deep raids would prove how much blood that strategy demanded. The sky above Europe was about to become a crucible, testing not only machines and tactics, but the endurance of men who faced death in the cold, thin air. And as the B-17s crossed the coast toward the heart of Germany, the Luftwaffe waited, ready to test whether American firepower could truly stand against experience, speed, and the precision of German engineering. By mid-1943, the war in the air had reached a fever pitch. The 8th Air Force was now launching daily raids from England across the Channel into German territory. The targets were bold: submarine pens in Bremen, ball-bearing plants in Schweinfurt, aircraft factories in Regensburg. Each mission tested the limits of the men and the machines that carried them. The Luftwaffe, no longer unchallenged, responded with skill and ferocity. Squadrons of Messerschmitt Bölf 109C and Focke-Wulf 190S climbed to intercept the bomber streams, diving from the sun to exploit the bomber's vulnerable angles. They aimed not at random, they targeted engines, cockpits, and fuel tanks, using 20mm cannon shells that could rip through aluminum skin and ignite a bomber in seconds. Every raid became a brutal exchange, speed and maneuver against armor and firepower. At 20,000 feet, the air was so thin that every maneuver risked stalling. The Germans, often fighting at the edge of their engine limits, would attack in quick bursts, break off, and climb again for another pass. The Americans, flying in tight formation, had only one defense: overlapping walls of .50 caliber fire. Each bomber's guns covered the blind spots of its neighbors. Nose gunners guarded the front arcs, waist gunners swept the flanks, while the tail gunner protected the rear approach. The top and ball turrets rotated constantly, watching the skies like sentinels. In these formations, often 18 to 20 bombers wide, stacked in altitude layers, the firepower of dozens of M2 SEM merged into one deadly defensive web. When the first attacks came, the formation would light up with hundreds of glowing tracers, red lines slicing across the pale sky. A German pilot diving into that storm faced not a single machine gun, but the combined fire of 20 or 30. For every one bomber that fell, several fighters were often damaged or destroyed. But the price was heavy. The missions to Schweinfurt and Regensburg in August 1943 became grim legends. Out of 376 bombers sent, 60 were lost in a single day. Many more limped home with engines destroyed and wings torn. The Luftwaffe's fighters were relentless, and without long-range escort fighters, the bombers were alone for hundreds of miles. Inside the aircraft, the toll was measured in exhaustion and courage. Gunners rotated between stations to keep blood circulating in frozen limbs. Oxygen masks froze from their own breath. A hit to a gun mount or feed system could jam a weapon, leaving a sector unguarded. Yet still they fired, belt after belt, hour after hour, the steady rhythm of the .50 caliber echoing through the fuselage. The Americans learned fast. The early raids revealed weaknesses in both tactics and equipment. Armor plating was added around gun positions, and new heated suits were issued to combat frostbite. Coordination improved. Gunners learned to fire in bursts, conserving ammunition for critical moments. Crews practiced communication drills until it became instinct. Meanwhile, German pilots adapted too. Some attacked head-on, where the bombers' return fire was weakest. Others used rockets to scatter formations before closing in with cannons. The battle became a deadly chess match played at 5 miles above the earth. Yet the fundamental truth remained: As long as the bombers could maintain formation, the .50 caliber could hold the line. The gun's reliability was legendary. Even after thousands of rounds fired in freezing temperatures, it rarely jammed. Mechanics in the airfields cleaned and reassembled the guns by hand every night, ensuring they were ready for the next day's sortie. By late 1943, the defensive tactics were refined to an art. Bomb groups coordinated altitudes and flight paths with mathematical precision, ensuring overlapping arcs of fire. From a distance, the formations resembled iron fortresses drifting across the sky, each bomber supporting the next, their collective firepower turning the air into a storm of metal. For the Luftwaffe, these walls of guns posed a growing problem. Their experienced pilots were being lost faster than they could be replaced. Training new flyers took months. Producing new aircraft took longer. And as the Allies continued to improve their aircraft and tactics, the balance in the air began to shift. Slowly, but unmistakably. The American .50 caliber had not only defended its bombers, it had forced the enemy to adapt, to rethink, and to bleed resources. The Germans could no longer rely on intimidation or surprise. Each attack carried higher risk, and each loss of an experienced pilot weakened their edge. High above the clouds, the tide of air superiority was beginning to turn. But victory was not yet secured. The true test, the great clashes that would decide the skies of Europe, was still to come. And in those coming months, the .50 caliber would not only defend, it would go on the offensive. Inside a flying fortress, there was no quiet. The engines thundered non-stop, a deafening rhythm that filled the fuselage like a heartbeat. Oxygen hissed through narrow rubber tubes. The sound of metal rattling against the slipstream echoed through the thin shell of the aircraft, and over it all came the voice of the gunner, calm, clipped, trained. Bandits, 11 o'clock high. The gunners of the 8th Air Force were often in their late teens or early 20s. They had been trained in weeks to handle one of the most powerful machine guns ever made. Each man knew the weight of his job, to guard the crew, to watch the horizon, to fire only when necessary, and to never stop firing once the enemy came close. They worked in conditions few could imagine. Temperatures of 40 degrees below zero. Oxygen so thin that breathing without a mask meant blacking out in seconds. Every mission meant hours of standing in cramped, unheated gun positions, eyes stinging, hands freezing, tracing the faint glimmer of enemy fighters. When the attack began, adrenaline overrode fear. The moment the gunner pressed the butterfly trigger, the vibration shook through his entire body. The M2 kicked hard, its barrel glowing red under sustained fire. Empty brass casings rained across the floor, clinking against the metal fuselage. The sound was deafening, yet rhythmic, a roar that merged with the hum of engines into a single terrible harmony. Many crews said the sight of the glowing tracers, every fifth round a burning line of red, gave them hope. It was proof that they were still fighting, still alive. The .50 caliber became more than a weapon. It was a companion, a constant presence in the chaos. The M2 Browning was not a new invention by the time of the Second World War, but it was near perfection. John Browning's original design from the 1920s had barely changed. It was air-cooled, recoil-operated, and built with precision-machined steel components that could endure endless punishment. Each .50 BMG cartridge weighed nearly 2 ounces. Its bullet alone, half an inch wide, carried more than 10 times the energy of a rifle round. Fired at nearly 3,000 feet per second, it could shred through aircraft armor, ignite fuel tanks, or shear off wings. Even near misses were often enough to cripple a fighter. What made it special was not only power, but consistency. The weapon's simplicity meant it could be stripped, cleaned, and reassembled by hand in minutes. It rarely jammed. It fired in any weather, at any altitude, from ground, air, or sea. In an age when mechanical failure could mean death, reliability was everything. Mounted on bombers, the M2 adapted beautifully. Flexible mounts allowed 360-degree rotation. Twin-gun turrets concentrated fire into deadly streams. Remote-controlled systems like those later used in the B-29 proved the gun's versatility and precision. Even the ammunition evolved. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds were developed to maximize damage to enemy aircraft. When a German fighter made a pass, it often flew directly into clouds of explosive fire, bullets that could pierce, ignite, and fragment on impact. This combination of engineering and production made the M2 an unmatched tool of air defense. It was not the most glamorous weapon, nor the most modern, but it was unstoppable, a perfect balance of simplicity and lethality. Air combat in the early 1940s was a rapidly evolving science. The United States entered the war believing in formation flying, a principle that turned individual bombers into one coordinated machine. The box formation developed by the 8th Air Force placed bombers in staggered groups, each protecting the blind spots of the others. This arrangement maximized the reach of the .50 calibers. No German pilot could approach from any direction without facing at least 3 or 4 intersecting lines of fire. Commanders described these formations as moving fortresses. The key was discipline. Each pilot held his position exactly too close, and the bombers risked collision too far, and the defensive web broke apart. During attacks, the gunners relied on communication as much as instinct. Spotters would call out direction, distance, and altitude in rapid, practiced bursts. Bandit, 9 o'clock low, break high, break high. The coordination was almost musical, each gunner firing in bursts to conserve ammunition while maintaining constant coverage. Over time, tactics evolved. Crews learned that firing in short, controlled bursts kept barrels cool and improved accuracy. They practiced staggered bursts, where gunners would fire in sequence, ensuring a continuous rain of tracers without overheating the guns. The Luftwaffe quickly learned that breaking through such a wall of fire was perilous. Some German pilots described attacking bomber formations as flying into a furnace. Others called it suicide. Even elite squadrons like JG-26 suffered mounting losses, often losing multiple aircraft for every bomber destroyed. By the end of 1943, the .50 caliber had done more than defend bombers. It had changed the very nature of aerial combat. It forced the enemy to adapt, to think differently, to reconsider tactics built on speed and surprise. And as the Luftwaffe's frustration grew, so did the Americans' confidence. The next phase would take that same weapon and turn it from a shield into a spear. For the Luftwaffe, the American bombers were a problem unlike any they had faced before. In 1943, most German pilots had grown accustomed to fast, decisive battles. On the Eastern Front, they attacked Soviet formations with quick dives and climbs, using their superior maneuverability to dominate. Against the British at night, they relied on radar and surprise. But the American daylight raids changed everything. The B-17s and B-24s came in tight formations, disciplined, predictable, and bristling with guns. Each bomber seemed almost impregnable, its defenses extending in every direction. A frontal attack meant facing a dozen .50 caliber guns head-on. A rear assault brought the deadly precision of the tail gunners and top turrets. The German pilots soon realized they could not win with conventional tactics. The 20mm cannon shells of the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 could destroy a bomber with a few hits, but reaching firing distance was often fatal. To counter the American firepower, the Luftwaffe developed specialized tactics. They formed Sturmgruppen, assault wings armed with heavy armor, and additional cannons designed specifically to break bomber formations. Some pilots even flew aircraft stripped of radios and armor plating to reduce weight and increase speed. Others used rockets, the Werfer Granate 21, to scatter bomber groups before moving in for the kill. But none of it was enough. The sheer volume of .50 caliber fire turned the sky into a killing field. Veteran ace Adolf Galland later admitted that attacking American formations was like charging into the wall of a fortress. Even when German pilots scored hits, many were caught by defensive bursts from neighboring bombers. The Luftwaffe's best squadrons began losing men faster than they could be replaced. Every lost pilot represented years of training, skill, and irreplaceable combat experience. And as the attrition grew, the once elite Luftwaffe found itself stretched thin, defending the Reich from an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with every passing month. The .50 caliber machine gun was not just a defensive weapon. It was the linchpin of an entire strategy. The American doctrine of daylight precision bombing depended on it. The concept was simple: bomb by day for accuracy, rely on firepower for survival. This strategy required not only bravery but engineering precision. Each bomber had to fly in perfect formation. Each gunner had to perform without hesitation. The formations were flying fortresses in name and in practice, with interlocking layers of fire that gave each squadron its own protective shell. But there was also a deeper logic behind it. Every German fighter shot down or forced to withdraw weakened the Luftwaffe's control of its own airspace. The bombers were not merely delivering explosives. They were baiting the enemy into battle, draining his strength in the skies above his own homeland. The cost was high, but the strategic value was immense. The Daylight Campaign forced Germany to divert massive resources, aircraft, fuel, pilots, and anti-aircraft defenses, away from the Eastern Front and the Mediterranean. Every B-17 that flew to Berlin pulled the Luftwaffe's attention away from the ground war. And once long-range escort fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang arrived, the equation changed completely. Armed with 6.50 caliber guns each, these fighters carried the same firepower as entire bomber turrets, but with speed and agility. The weapon that had defended the bombers now became the tool that hunted their hunters. By early 1944, the Allies had achieved the unthinkable: air superiority over Europe. The skies that had once belonged to the Luftwaffe now roared with American engines and the crack of Browning machine guns. Behind every .50 caliber round fired over Germany was the weight of American industry, the vast network of factories, workers, and engineers that transformed the nation into the arsenal of democracy. In the assembly lines of Buffalo, Detroit, and Bridgeport, thousands of workers produced the Browning M2 and its ammunition in staggering numbers. Each gun required over 100 precision-machined parts. Each bullet demanded brass, lead, powder, and steel, all made to exacting standards. Yet production never slowed. Even as men went to the front, women filled the factories. They worked long hours, their hands guiding the presses that stamped out the casings for the rounds that would defend their husbands, brothers, and sons in the air. This industrial power became a moral weapon in itself. It represented unity, a nation's collective determination to fight a distant war, and to do so with precision and purpose. Germany, fighting under constant bombardment, could not match this pace. Its factories were stretched to the breaking point. Its fuel supply dwindled, and while the Luftwaffe struggled to replace each aircraft and pilot, the United States rolled new machines off its assembly lines daily. The .50 caliber was more than a symbol of firepower. It was the embodiment of an idea that strength lay not only in the courage of soldiers, but in the resolve of an entire nation to arm them. Every tracer that streaked across the sky over Europe carried that message. It told the enemy that the Americans would not yield, that their machines would keep flying, and their guns would keep firing, until the sky itself changed hands. And soon that change would come, in a series of battles that would shatter the Luftwaffe's last defenses and mark the turning point of the air war. Autumn 1943. The sky above Germany was no longer blue. It was grey with contrails, flak bursts, and smoke. The air war had entered its bloodiest stage. On the morning of October 14th, hundreds of B-17s from the 8th Air Force roared toward Schweinfurt, a critical centre for Germany's ball-bearing production. Without those factories, the Reich's aircraft, tanks, and vehicles would grind to a halt. The Americans knew it, so did the Germans. As the bombers crossed into enemy territory, radar stations on the ground detected their approach. Sirens wailed across Luftwaffe bases from Frankfurt to Würzburg. Mechanics rushed to ready aircraft. Pilots sprinted to their fighters. Within minutes, the sky would be alive with hundreds of interceptors climbing to meet the formation. The first German attacks came swiftly. Messerschmitt Bf 109 said, dove from the sun in coordinated waves, aiming straight for the lead elements of the formation. Their cannons tore through the air, bursts of yellow flame streaking toward the bombers. The B-17s held formation, tight, unyielding, every man knowing that to break apart meant death. Inside each bomber, the gunners came alive. The moment they spotted the fighters, the call went out over the intercom. Bandits, 3 o'clock high, then the roar began. Dozens of Messes 2s thundered at once. The sound was deafening, a rolling wall of metallic rhythm that filled the sky. Tracer lines arced outward in every direction, weaving a glowing net around the formation. German pilots described it later as flying into a furnace. Many attacks broke off before closing in. Others pressed on and paid the price. A Bok 109 struck by multiple .50 caliber rounds often disintegrated in midair, its fuel igniting, its wings tearing away. A single hit to the engine block or cockpit could end it instantly. But the bombers were paying dearly too. The Luftwaffe had learned to concentrate on weak points, attacking the head and tail of the formations to break their cohesion. Flak from the ground exploded around them, filling the sky with shrapnel. Each burst could shred aluminum and flesh alike. Crews reported entire sections blown away, yet still they flew on. The mission to Schweinfurt became a legend of courage and loss. 60 bombers were destroyed. Hundreds of airmen were killed or captured. Yet the survivors pressed on, releasing their bomb loads over the target and turning for home. As they crossed back into friendly airspace, battered and burning, the scale of the sacrifice became clear, but so did the message. The .50 caliber guns had kept them alive. Without that firepower, not a single formation would have survived the long hours inside German airspace. In those moments, the Browning Men 2 was no longer just a tool, it was the heartbeat of the mission. The Luftwaffe, though victorious that day in losses inflicted, had paid a price it could ill afford. Dozens of its best pilots were gone. Each one represented years of training, experience and leadership, and with every new raid, that cost grew heavier. In the following months, the Americans returned again and again, Regensburg, Bremen and Berlin. Each city became a target, each mission a test of endurance. The .50 caliber guns fired tens of thousands of rounds per mission, their barrels glowing red, their feed belts smoking from heat. Crews learned to rotate gunners mid-flight to prevent exhaustion. They learned to fire in short bursts, to lead their targets by instinct, to trust the steady pulse of the gun in their hands. By late 1943, bomber crews began to see something change. Fewer German attacks pressed home. More fighters turned away before closing distance. Reports came in of enemy aircraft breaking formation after losing wingmen to concentrated .50 caliber fire. The weapon had done what it was designed to do. It had made the cost of attack too high. But the Americans knew the balance was still fragile. They were still losing aircraft at a rate no air force could sustain indefinitely. A new solution was needed, not just defense, but dominance. The bombers needed guardians that could fly with them all the way to the heart of the Reich and back. And soon that guardian would arrive, armed with the same weapon that had defended the bombers so fiercely, the fighter that would carry the .50 caliber from shield to sword. By early 1944, the thunder of American bombers had become a daily sound over occupied Europe. But now, something new flew alongside them, sleek, silver fighters, with long noses and elegant wings, glinting in the cold sunlight. The North American P-51 Mustang had arrived. The Mustang was everything the bombers needed, fast, agile, and with drop tanks that gave it the range to escort the formations deep into Germany. It could finally do what earlier fighters could not: stay with the bombers all the way to the target and home again. And like the bombers it guarded, it carried the same heartbeat: 6 Browning .50 caliber M2 machine guns, 3 in each wing. Each gun fired the same powerful cartridge as the bomber's defensive mounts, but here, the weapon was transformed into a blade. With a combined rate of fire over 4,000 rounds per minute, the Mustang could tear through enemy aircraft in seconds. Pilots described the effect as overwhelming, like holding a buzzsaw in the sky. The arrival of the Mustang changed the air war almost overnight. The Luftwaffe, which had once chosen when and where to attack, now found itself hunted. Full 51 Sir roamed ahead of the bomber streams, sweeping the airfields, diving on interceptors before they could climb. .50 caliber that had once guarded the formations now reached out to strike first. When the P-51S engaged, the sky became a ballet of speed and fire. A Messerschmitt would dive to attack the bombers, but from above and behind, a Mustang appeared, its 6 guns flashing. In an instant, the German fighter was torn apart, fragments scattering into the clouds. Pilots later recalled how they could see the .50 caliber tracers walking across the enemy's fuselage, the hits glowing orange before the aircraft burst into flame. The .50 caliber proved devastating, not only against fighters but also against bombers, trains, and ground targets. Its armor-piercing incendiary rounds could destroy locomotives, puncture fuel tanks, and rip apart trucks. The weapon's versatility meant that every Mustang sortie inflicted damage far beyond the immediate air battle. The Germans tried desperately to adapt. They deployed the Me-410 heavy fighter, armed with powerful cannons designed to strike from beyond the range of the bomber's guns. They developed jet fighters like the Me-262, hoping that speed could overcome the flood of American firepower. But the reality was brutal. The Luftwaffe could no longer control the skies. The combination of bombers and escorts, all armed with .50 caliber guns, became an unstoppable storm. The Americans began striking targets once considered untouchable: Leipzig, Munich, Berlin, burning away the industrial heart of the Reich. By the spring of 1944, the air battles reached their crescendo. During what came to be known as Big Week in February, the 8th and 15th Air Forces launched hundreds of raids in a coordinated assault on German aircraft production. Thousands of B-17s and B-24s filled the sky, escorted by swarms of P-51S and P-47S. The Luftwaffe responded with everything it had left. Hundreds of German fighters rose to meet the oncoming wave, turning the skies into a swirling storm of contrails, explosions, and fire. But this time, the outcome was different. The Mustang pilots tore into the German formations, their .50 calibers cutting down enemy aircraft in every direction. The bombers behind them kept formation, their gunners adding to the storm of fire. The air filled with tracers, red, orange, and white, weaving across the sky in deadly arcs. In a single week, the Luftwaffe lost more than 600 aircraft, and many of its remaining veteran pilots. The backbone of German air defense was shattered. From that moment onward, air superiority belonged to the Allies. German cities burned under waves of bombers that now flew almost unopposed. Factories that had once built aircraft were reduced to rubble. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was crippled. American pilots could now strike anywhere, anytime. The .50 caliber had done what few imagined possible. It had carried the fight from defense to domination, from desperation to control. For the men who flew those missions, the change was profound. Only a year earlier, they had prayed to survive each flight. Now they flew with confidence, knowing the balance had shifted in their favor. The once deadly German fighters were now the hunted. In the cold air above Europe, the rhythmic pulse of the Browning M2 echoed across the sky, the same weapon that had guarded the bombers now clearing their path to victory. And as the Allies prepared for the next phase, the invasion of Normandy, the .50 caliber would continue to guard, to strike, and to define the sound of American air power. By the summer of 1944, the skies over Europe no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. They belonged to the thunder of American engines and the relentless crack of the .50 caliber Browning. Where once German fighters climbed in disciplined formations, now they scrambled in desperation. The Luftwaffe's training schools had emptied, sending barely trained pilots to face seasoned American airmen. Many of these young Germans took off in machines that would never return. The statistics told the story in cold, unfeeling numbers. Between February and June of 1944, the Luftwaffe lost nearly half of its operational strength. Hundreds of aircraft were destroyed each month, many before they even reached the bombers. The Allies, meanwhile, were producing planes faster than Germany could replace them. This imbalance was magnified by the weapon that armed nearly every American aircraft in the theater, the Browning M2. Its reliability was legendary. Even in freezing altitudes where other guns jammed, the .50 caliber fired, Crews often called it the sound of survival. In the tight, deafening fuselage of a B-17, the gunners learned to trust that sound. Each time German fighters appeared, the air would fill with the roar of the M2 cell. A wall of fire would form around the formation, turning the sky into a deadly storm. No attacker could easily penetrate. German veterans later described the experience as terrifying. Diving through the contrails toward the bombers, they would see 1,000 flickering lights, the flash of hundreds of machine guns firing at once. The air itself seemed alive with tracers. A single pass could end in disaster. Even if they reached the bombers, their fragile aircraft were riddled with bullet holes before they could escape. As the German defense crumbled, American strategy evolved. The focus shifted from survival to dominance. Fighter groups were ordered to free hunt, to abandon escort formations, and seek out enemy aircraft, airfields and trains. With 6.50 caliber guns, a Mustang or Thunderbolt could devastate almost any target it found. The skies over France and Germany became hunting grounds. Fighter pilots strafed locomotives, trucks and troop convoys, cutting off supply lines that were vital to the German front. Villages trembled as low-flying aircraft unleashed streams of .50 caliber rounds into moving columns. Bridges collapsed, roads burned and communication lines shattered. Every round fired was part of a greater strategy, to choke the German war machine before the invasion of Normandy. And by June 6, when Allied troops stormed the beaches, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Few German aircraft appeared over the invasion fleet. Those that did were quickly driven off or destroyed. The success was built not only on the courage of the crews, but also on the weapon that had armed them all. The .50 caliber Browning had become the universal language of American air power, mounted on bombers, fighters, reconnaissance planes, and even landing craft. It was the hammer that cleared the skies and the shield that protected the men below. In the months that followed, the Allied advance deepened into German territory. Cities that had once been fortresses now lay open under the constant roar of bombers. From Berlin to the Ruhr, the industrial heart of the Reich was shattered. The Luftwaffe still fought bravely, but its wings had been broken. Every mission came at a terrible cost. Pilots shot down faster than they could be replaced, machines falling from the sky in flames. The Americans, meanwhile, had achieved what no air force before them ever had, near total air supremacy across an entire continent. The sound of victory, to those who lived through it, was not the trumpet or the drum. It was the deep, rhythmic thunder of the .50 caliber Browning, echoing through the cold European sky. When the war in Europe drew to its brutal close in May 1945, the skies were silent once again. But the legacy of those high-altitude battles endured, written not only in the wreckage scattered across the continent, but also in the doctrines of modern air power. The Browning M2 had proven something profound, that reliability, volume of fire and versatility could change the course of war as decisively as any new technology. It was not the heaviest weapon in the sky, nor the most advanced, yet it had been everywhere, from the frozen peaks of the Alps to the burning fields of Normandy. It armed the bombers that leveled industrial cities, the fighters that swept the air clear of resistance, and even the tanks that rolled through the ruins below. The German High Command, in its post-war reports, acknowledged the weapon's impact. They noted that the .50 caliber's balance of range and destructive power made it particularly effective against lightly armored aircraft. At close range, its armor-piercing incendiary rounds could penetrate cockpits, fuel tanks and engine blocks, igniting fires that doomed even the toughest Luftwaffe fighters. For American airmen, the weapon had become more than machinery. It was a companion through endless missions, the steady rhythm that marked the passage of danger and survival. Gunners often spoke of their affection for the M2, giving each gun a name or marking the barrel with victories. When the shooting stopped, many wrote that the silence afterward felt unnatural, as if something vital had vanished with the end of combat. In the broader arc of history, the .50 caliber also defined the American approach to warfare, combining industrial capacity with relentless standardization. By using a single adaptable weapon across countless platforms, the United States had simplified logistics and amplified firepower on every front. Ammunition flowed from the same factories to air bases, ships, and army depots. Mechanics could repair or replace parts anywhere in the world. That efficiency, born of mass production and design brilliance, became a cornerstone of American military power. The Luftwaffe's defeat also reshaped global thinking about air combat. The age of the cannon-armed interceptor faded, replaced by the era of high-speed, high-volume machine gun fire, soon followed by jet and missile warfare. Yet even as technology advanced, the core lesson remained: control of the air required not only advanced aircraft, but weapons that could be trusted under the most punishing conditions. After the war, the M2 did not retire. It became the standard weapon of the United States and its allies for decades. Mounted on jet fighters, helicopters, tanks, and naval vessels, it served in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. Its unmistakable sound, that deep rhythmic pounding, echoed again across mountains, jungles, and deserts. By the time the 20th century ended, the Browning M2 had fought in more wars, on more continents than any other automatic weapon of its class. It had outlived the men who designed it, and the machines it once armed. And yet, in its enduring simplicity, it carried the memory of those freezing altitudes where men fought and died for control of the sky. For Germany, the loss of the air war marked the beginning of the end. The once feared Luftwaffe dwindled to fragments, its great aces scattered, its factories destroyed. Without air cover, the German army could no longer maneuver freely. Every move, every supply line, every retreat was watched and punished from above. The Americans had achieved more than victory in the air. They had demonstrated a principle that would define warfare for generations: that the side which owns the sky owns the future. And the weapon that helped secure that dominance, round after round, burst after burst, was the humble yet unstoppable .50 caliber Browning. In the long quiet after victory, the echoes of the .50 caliber still lingered, not as noise but as memory. For the men who had lived through those missions, the sound was more than just gunfire. It was the heartbeat of survival, the pulse of a generation that fought in thin air and freezing silence. Many of them never saw the faces of the enemies they fought. Their battles were waged through metal sights and clouds of vapor, over landscapes blurred by altitude and fear. Yet every pull of the trigger carried the weight of a world in peril. The .50 caliber Browning M2 was never meant to be a symbol. It was designed as a tool, precise, dependable, and unrelenting. But through the war, it became something more. It embodied the industrial will of a nation that refused to surrender the sky. It turned ordinary men, factory workers, farmers, students, into the guardians of steel giants that crossed oceans and continents. In the cold arithmetic of history, wars are often measured by tonnage and tactics. But behind those numbers lie the tools that defined them, and the people who trusted those tools with their lives. The Browning .50 caliber was one of those instruments, as much a part of the Allied victory as any general's plan or soldier's bravery. When the final bombers returned home and the last missions were flown, the weapon remained, oiled, worn, ready. Its purpose had outlived the war, its sound a reminder of a time when freedom was decided in the thin, frozen air above a divided world. And so the story of American firepower at high altitude is not just a tale of technology, it is a story of endurance, precision, and faith in the tools that protect those who dare to fight. In that endless sky, where the cold bites and the silence never ends, the steady rhythm of the .50 caliber still speaks, the voice of those who would not yield,